Good afternoon, I'm Susanna Heschel, Chair of the Jewish Studies Program, and I welcome all of you to the lecture today. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to give you some announcements, so please get your pencils out. I want to announce some forthcoming events. First of all, some of you know already, we've had a series this summer of lunchtime seminars, student-faculty seminars on Thursdays, at which our 3 visiting postdoctoral fellows from Berlin have been presenting their research. The third one is going to be this coming Thursday, August 11th, and that presentation is by Małgorzata Maksimiak, and that will be in Haldeman 125. The following Thursday at 12 noon, we'll hear from Yahel Matalon, who is actually a graduate student at Yale. She's going to speak on the Dybbuk, and that's going to be in the Rockefeller Center in the 1930s room. If you can't keep all of this written down, you can email me and I'll tell you everything. I also want to tell you some unexpectedly happy news, which is that the Consul General from Germany to New England, who is based in Boston, contacted me just a few days ago. In fact, yesterday I got the title. He's coming to speak at Dartmouth this coming Thursday at 4:30 in Rocky 2. And he's going to talk about German-Jewish relations, especially as understood in light of the Syrian refugee crisis and the Syrians who are being invited to come to Germany. So I hope you will join Dr. Ralph Horleman to hear his talk this Thursday, 4:30 in Rocky 2. Then, about an hour ago, I got an email from Karen Conrud. She is the director of the special production of The Merchant of Venice that was done this summer in the Jewish ghetto of Venice. You may have read the big article about it in the New York Times. So she's worked on this production for a long time. She actually enlisted Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to serve as the judge in Act 4 of the play in the courtroom scene. So it was a fascinating production. She had 5 different actors playing Shylock, for example, and this was a production held outside, so she made use of the buildings of the Jewish ghetto in Venice as the backdrop for the play. She is coming on Monday, August 22nd to give a talk. I don't yet have the room, but I hope that you'll mark the date, Monday, August 22nd, so just before the summer term ends. It's a great pleasure to welcome Matthew Nosanchuk to Dartmouth, and I'm grateful to him for agreeing to come here to speak this summer. One of the main reasons he's here is that we have so many wonderful students taking our Jewish Studies courses this summer, and since sometimes, occasionally, rare occasion, some parent might ask a student, what can you do with a major in Jewish Studies? Matthew Nosanchuk is the answer. Matthew Nosanchuk, who graduated from Stanford University as an undergraduate and also got his law degree at Stanford Law School, has served in multiple capacities in the Obama administration for many years. From 2009 to 2012, he was at the Department of Justice, where he worked in the Division of Civil Rights and participated in the overturning of DOMA. From 2012 to 13, he was in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as legal counsel. From 2013 to 2016, he was in the White House. He was serving there as the White House liaison to the American Jewish community as an associate director of public engagement for the White House Office of Public Engagement. He also served as director for outreach on the National Security Council. So these are all thrilling positions to hold, and that's why we take Jewish Studies courses, and I might mention parenthetically that Matthew himself studied with the very great historian Amos Funkenstein when he was an undergraduate at Stanford and wrote his senior undergraduate thesis on the history of Zionism. Now, Matthew, in April, completed his tenure at the White House and has now moved to the U.S. State Department, where he is a senior advisor in the Secretary's Office of Religion and Global Affairs. He's come to us today to talk about his career, his activities, his work, and again, we are grateful that you're here, Matthew, and welcome you to Dartmouth.
I'm sort of tempted to stand in the middle of the room as opposed to over in the corner. Is that all right?
Sure.
So it just feels like I'm off and behind the screen. I teach a law school class at Georgetown, and the students are always like, you're looking at a wall of screens. I don't want you to be looking at, and usually they're on Facebook. But I don't want you to click on Facebook behind the screen here. So thank you very much, Professor Heschel, for a very kind introduction and for inviting me to speak to all of you this afternoon at Dartmouth College, which I visited many, many years ago as a high school student looking for colleges. And I want to also thank Greg Poon for picking me up today in Manchester. That's a long drive, and I really appreciated having someone there to guide me here, because I'd probably be lost somewhere in Vermont. So, so how did this event come about, first of all? So I met Professor Heschel in 2013. I had just started working at the White House in July of that year, and we had a major event at the White House in August of 2013, which was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. So this was a major, civil rights commemoration in the Obama presidency in Washington, one of the, obviously most famous speeches in American history delivered there. And I felt it was very important in that event, where you had many speakers speaking at the Lincoln Memorial, to have, and receptions and other events. I felt it was important that there be representation from the American Jewish community in these commemorations. And President Obama actually has recognized the role that American Jews have played in civil rights struggles in this country on multiple occasions, including in his most recent proclamation for Jewish American Heritage Month, where he wrote, many of the Jewish people who reached our nation's shores throughout our history did so fleeing the oppression they encountered in areas around the world. Driven by the possibility of charting a freer future, they endeavored on their own and as a community to make real the promise of America in their individual lives and in the life of our country. Determined to confront the racism that kept this promise from being fully realized, many Jewish Americans found a cause in the civil rights movement that, in its call for freedom and justice, echoed the timeless message of Exodus and the Jewish people's journey through the ages. Reflecting on the march in Selma, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel once noted, quote, "I felt my legs were praying," unquote. From the fight for women's rights to LGBT rights to workers' rights, many in the Jewish American community, drawing on lessons from their own past, have trumpeted a clarion call for equality and justice. So, obviously, I'm reading that quote because Suzanne's father is mentioned, but it is a summation of the role that American Jews have played for generations, and I guess I'm one of them in helping to further civil rights in this country. So when I had the opportunity to include a couple of people in one of the very exclusive White House receptions, I immediately thought of Rabbi Heschel and went to Suzanne and said, "Hey, do you want to come to the White House for this event?" And she said, "Of course I do," and she came. And we met then, and Suzanne and Professor Heschel mentioned that she'd like me to come to Dartmouth, and it never happened. Working at the White House is a 24/7 endeavor. We, more often than not, had people come to us and had very little opportunity to travel around and speak to groups. So this past May, I guess it was, after I had just left the White House, I was at the Days of Remembrance, Holocaust Days of Remembrance ceremony at the U.S. Capitol, and I saw Professor Heschel from across the room, and I ran over to her and I said hello, and she reminded me that she wanted me to come to Dartmouth and said, "How about this summer?" And I said, "If there are people there, that sounds great." And so here I am today. And I'm here right at a time as the Obama administration is kind of drawing to a close. We're not quite at the 2-minute warning, but we're getting close. After the 2012 election, the Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, passed this little card around to all of us who work in the White House, and it had printed on it, "Amazing things happened in the fourth quarter." And that was before we knew that amazing things would happen in the fourth quarter, and indeed they have, and we'll talk about some of those during the course of my talk. But my experience with the Obama administration goes back well before President Obama took office. As President Heschel mentioned, I went to Stanford Law School, and there I was a senior note editor on the Stanford Law Review. in a year when I remember reading a New York Times article about a young African-American law student at Harvard, sort of contemporary, a bunch of my friends who were in school with him, had just been elected to become the first African-American president of the Harvard Law Review, and he had, a quote, as he says, funny name. I know, because I have a funny name too, right? And so I remembered him. And as it turned out, after graduating from law school, I went to Chicago, where I did a judicial clerkship for a federal court of appeals judge, and that was followed by a fellowship at the ACLU of Illinois. And during my fellowship, I was able to become involved politically. And that year, I got involved in a Senate campaign of an exciting African-American candidate for the U.S. Senate from Illinois. And it wasn't Barack Obama, it was a woman named Carol Moseley Braun. For some of you, I'm sure, remember, others may not. But she was a local city official who kind of was catapulted to fame when she beat the incumbent Democratic senator in the primary and became a candidate for U.S. Senate in what was known as the Year of the Woman. And during that time, I volunteered on her campaign, planned a fundraiser for young lawyers, and at the conclusion of that fundraiser, a guy comes up to me and he says, hey, I just want to introduce myself. I'm doing voter registration work on the south side of Chicago and teaching constitutional law at the Chicago Law School. Here's my card. Let me know if I can become involved. And that was Barack Obama. And of course, I remembered him because I remember reading about him in the New York Times when he was the president of Harvard Law Review. So I met him, very briefly then. And then a year later, as I was completing my fellowship in Chicago, I was trying to decide whether to move to Washington or stay in Chicago. And there was one sort of small civil rights law firm in Chicago that I had interviewed at. I had 3 associates and like 5 partners, and one of the associates was Barack Obama. He was doing community development work in Chicago, and I had to meet with and interview with everybody, and I did, and they offered me a job, and I turned it down and moved to Washington, D.C. So fast forward to 11 years to 2004 and the Democratic Convention. I had sort of, not kept in touch with the folks from these law firms, but I had read, about Barack Obama. He left that firm. He, run unsuccessfully for U.S. Congress. And then in 2004, I went to Boston to the Democratic Convention and was standing there on the floor when this young Senate candidate gets up and, wows the world with this unbelievable speech. And everybody many people at that speech, including me, think, gee, this guy has real potential. And so, I began to drink the Kool-Aid back in 2004, and later had the opportunity to interact with him at a fundraiser in Washington when friends of mine who were friends of his from law school said, hey, why don't you come and meet Barack and Michelle? And I said, okay, sure. And it's funny, I actually met Barack Obama. He'll never remember me, many years ago. So I go up to meet him, and he kind of hears my name, and he kind of looks at me, and he kind of wags his finger at me and says, oh yeah, you're that hotshot that turned us down. So he did remember me, and of course being called a hotshot by Barack Obama, I don't quite know how to interpret that, because he's kind of the ultimate hotshot, right? So when 3 years later he decided to run for president, I was kind of immediately on board. Once he won decisively in Iowa, in the Iowa caucuses, I literally bought a plane ticket to New Hampshire to come to New Hampshire primary because I was positive that he would win the New Hampshire primary and it would be all over and he would be the nominee and he would be elected president. Well, for those of you who are in New Hampshire, or otherwise, you remember it didn't quite end up that way. Everyone thought he was going to win the New Hampshire primary, but he lost it. But he felt, and I remember being in this small gathering with him the night of that primary. He gave an incredible speech in Nashville that night. But he said to this group, it actually was okay that we lost. We kind of were riding really, really high and needed to kind of be brought down a little bit. So, notwithstanding that, he ultimately, obviously prevailed in the primaries. I continued to be involved, to help to advise him on LGBT issues and would help chair the policy committee on LGBT issues during the campaign, and ended up going down to Florida for the last 3 months of the campaign, where I did research work and communications work, and also some community organizing work in South Florida. So that's sort of my kind of history, leading up to the Obama administration. And in the Obama administration itself, it's really my identities both as an openly gay man and an American Jew that have shaped my experiences working in the administration. So I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I moved into the city with my mom after my parents separated. I'd been born in Windsor, Canada, across from Detroit. We moved over to Detroit when my parents separated. We kind of moved in when most whites were moving out of Detroit. It was after the 1967 riots. But I had a pretty acute sense of race issues, I think, from that experience. And in terms of my own Jewish identity, we belong to a humanistic Jewish congregation that actually was founded in Michigan by a rabbi called Sherwin Wine, who was my rabbi. And this was secular Jewish humanism, very much rooted in Jewish culture and social justice, but not very much religion at all. No God, no Torah, anything like that. But I went, but it was clearly, formative for me. And the, current rabbi there, likes to sort of attribute, to the extent you attribute my Jewish studies study, he attributes my being part of this congregation to the work that I've done subsequently. So I went to Stanford, and I went during my junior year to Israel. Stanford had a program at the time in Israel. It was actually at Haifa University. And there, that was an experience that ended up being very relevant, many years later when I became a liaison of the Jewish community at the White House. Because although I'd been to Israel subsequently, that was really the time that I got to be there, live there, really understand the conflict, travel all over the place, to places you could never even travel to today, and really appreciate, the tensions and the problems and, geographic and strategic and challenges, religious challenges, all of that, which, is in full bloom today. Many of the issues were the same then. Of course, Israel is very different now, situation's very different now, but it gave me a grounding. And it just kind of goes to show you that things that you do in college, may not be immediately relevant to you, but they may become relevant many years later when you don't expect it. So, after graduating from Stanford, where I studied Jewish history, I studied international relations, I studied history, I went to Stanford Law School where I, undertook a more kind of domestic focus, studying constitutional law, studying civil rights, working after my first year of law school at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was, premier civil rights litigation organization founded by Thurgood Marshall, but which also had, through its history, very strong leadership from American Jews who also worked right alongside Thurgood Marshall to bring the key to desegregation and other cases that shaped our civil rights jurisprudence in America. Then, after clerking, I worked at the ACLU of Illinois, as I mentioned, and I worked on a project that was focused on HIV/AIDS. This was the early 1990s. It was a dramatically different time in our nation when it came to gay rights. This was a time where there was a tremendous amount of stigma connected to gays and lesbians because of HIV/AIDS. There were perception of public health risk. There was all kinds of discrimination that was not well founded, but was justified based on fear, the threat to public health. And it was a different time in my life. I was then, I was straight. I ultimately married a woman. I hadn't come out, but I worked, I was sort of like the straight guy working on these issues at the time, which is not very unusual now, but was much more unusual back then. And it was just another instance where I, got to do work on an area that is of interest of mine, where you have sort of competing values in policy debates, public health versus civil liberty. So when I was at Stanford, I wrote my third-year law school paper on the free speech debate on the Stanford campus, where you had, on the one hand, actually a Holocaust survivor, constitutional law professor, Gerald Gunther, who fervently believed, because of his own experience in Nazi Germany, in absolute free speech, versus those who were concerned about the environment on campus, the impact that hate speech could have. This debate is going on right now on college campuses throughout the country, and it was going on then as well. And then I went to the Clinton administration when I came to Washington, where you had, I became involved in the issue of guns, and there you have the, incredible, protracted debate over, the rights of people to possess firearms legally versus the right of all the rest of us to be safe in our communities and our homes from, rampant gun violence that exists in our country today. And we live in a country that, of course, has far more gun violence than any other developed country in the world. And this is, among other issues, an issue that the American Jewish community has played an incredibly important role in addressing, especially in recent months. So I joined so after President Obama won, I had the opportunity to join the administration, as Professor Heschel said, and the kind of bookends of my experience in the administration go from the sort of domestic end in the early part of the administration when I had a chance to work at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, and then to my experience in the White House, where I worked as a liaison to the American Jewish community on one of the key foreign policy priorities, battles of this administration, which I'll talk about in a bit. So, when I joined the administration, I was approached by then Assistant Attorney General, the nominee to be the Assistant Attorney General, Thomas Perez, who's now the Secretary of Labor. He was the first Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights for President Obama. And he asked me if I wanted to come to the Civil Rights Division. And of course, working in the Civil Rights Division for someone like me who had worked on these issues over the course of my career was really a dream come true. The Civil Rights Division has this incredibly important historic role in the Department of Justice to vindicate the rights of individuals, to protect them on the basis of race, ethnicity, disability, religion, to combat police brutality, and a whole host of issues. It plays a very unique role, and of course that role dates back to the 60s when Robert Kennedy was Attorney General, and the Civil Rights Division was an important player in securing and preserving voting rights, something that it also continues to work on today. So with the opportunity to join the Civil Rights Division, I thought that the role that I wanted to do was a role that actually didn't exist, because during the Bush administration, surprisingly, there wasn't anybody whose responsibility it was to work on LGBT rights. In fact, there had been a working group in the Bush administration, but in the Clinton administration, but it had been disbanded in the Bush administration, and so it was sort of a blank slate when we came in. So this working group was reestablished, and I came in to be the person who would have responsibility in the political leadership of the Civil Rights Division for LGBT issues. What did that mean? At the time, Tom Perez would say in his speeches that LGBT rights were the civil rights issue of the defining civil rights issue of the 21st century. But in the spring of 2009, none of us could have known at that time, how far and how fast this issue would evolve. When I was working on the campaign, as I mentioned, on LGBT policy, candidate Obama had a series of priorities. Passing a federal hate crime law that would extend nationwide protection to individuals from violence committed against them on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Repealing the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage for purposes of federal law, an entitlement of more than 1,100 benefits as being between one man and one woman. Repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, of course, which is a policy which basically said to gays and lesbians in the military that they had to keep their sexual orientation private and not act upon it or face dishonorable discharge from the military. Passage of a federal law that would prohibit discrimination in employment against LGBT individuals, something that didn't exist in 2009 and frankly still doesn't exist today. I mean, some states and localities have it, but there's no nationwide prohibition on discriminating against somebody on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And then candidate Obama didn't have his position on marriage equality in 2009 is that he didn't support marriage equality, which was the same position that every candidate running in that election held. So in 2009, you had that position of the candidate. You had 45 states with constitutional amendments or laws that banned marriage between same-sex couples. One state had marriage equality since 2004, Massachusetts. One state, California, got it in early of 2008 and then lost it after the 2000 election when Proposition 8 passed. New Hampshire's legislature adopted marriage equality in 2009, but the landscape was pretty bleak. And the administration, because the job of the Justice Department is to enforce the laws that Congress enacts with only rare, limited exceptions, was enforcing the Defense of Marriage Act. So we were being sued. We were not extending benefits to legally married same-sex couples. So we had a same-sex couple married in Massachusetts where they had legal marriage. They couldn't get federal health benefits. One of them worked in the government. She couldn't get it for her spouse. And that's just one, as I said, of like that one, 1,100 plus ways in which marriage determines what benefits you receive from the federal government. The Defense Department was continuing to enforce don't ask, don't tell, not so vigorously, but we were defending cases where we were being sued over it. There was no federal hate crimes law, even though Matthew Shepard had been murdered in Laramie, Wyoming, years before, and his parents, were tireless advocates for federal law that none had been enacted. And the Jewish community had played a very important role in the hate crimes fight because we are particularly sensitive to anti-Semitism and how it leads to violence. And among religiously motivated hate crimes in America, 60% of those are targeted at Jews. So my role there was to begin to help develop and implement these policy priorities of candidate Obama, given the legal realities on the ground. And I was, part of the team that was working in the department when we were still defending the Defense of Marriage Act. Albeit we were trying to defend it in ways that were perhaps less offensive than had been employed in the previous administration. Not claiming that the Defense of Marriage Act is justified on morality or because straight parents are any more fit to be parents than gay parents. So we abandoned all those kind of rationales and came up with others. But as the litigation evolved in this area, when we had an opening in late 2010, early 2011, to look anew at the whole question of how the law should treat the review of the Defense of Marriage Act. What level of constitutional review would you have for a law that discriminates on the basis of sexual orientation? We were able to look at this issue on a blank slate because cases had been filed in parts of the country where there was no governing precedent. And after a review was undertaken within the department that I was involved in, the President and the Attorney General made a decision in February of 2011, it was a huge momentous decision, that the Department of Justice was no longer going to continue to defend the Defense of Marriage Act because we didn't believe that there were reasonable constitutional arguments that could be made in support of the law. So that meant that all these lawsuits that were filed against the federal government, we weren't going to continue to make the same arguments that we were making to defend the law. In fact, we said we're not only going to not defend, we're going to affirmatively oppose the Defense of Marriage Act. We're going to go into court on behalf of the people who are suing us and say, actually, you're right. We think this law is unconstitutional, and this is an instance where we don't have a responsibility to defend a law that we cannot find any reasonable argument in support of it, and therefore we are going to urge courts to declare it unconstitutional with the expectation that that will lead to review by a final body, which would be the U.S. Supreme Court. And so this momentous decision resulted in Congress undertaking the defense of the law because we weren't making those arguments. And a succession of cases led to a Supreme Court case, United States versus Windsor, which which was decided in 2013. And incidentally, Edie Windsor, the plaintiff in that case, an 80-some-year-old Jewish woman from the Upper East Side of New York, whose same-sex spouse died, and she had an inheritance, and Edie's inheritance was being taxed, at a very high rate because she wasn't being treated as married, and therefore, she was having to pay all of the state taxes that she otherwise would not have had to pay, which was a great case to go up to the Supreme Court because, the conservative justices presumably aren't thrilled with taxes, and we thought this was a good case for them to decide. And Edie Windsor is a wonderful, elderly Jewish woman. She goes to CBST, the LGBT congregation in New York City, and so she is the person. She's the Brown of the gay rights movement, right, in terms of litigation. So in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a momentous decision, decided that the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional. They agree with us. There's no basis on which the federal government can legitimately discriminate against legally married same-sex couples and deny them the very same benefits that everybody else gets. It undermines and is inconsistent with the dignity of gay and lesbian couples and their families, wrote Justice Kennedy in a very powerful opinion, which the late Justice Scalia attacked and said, this decision is just going to lay the groundwork for declaring a fundamental right to marriage equality across the nation in all 50 states, which was a pretty good prediction, because 2 years later, the Supreme Court decided the Obergefell decision, which did exactly that. So when I was at the Department of Justice, in addition to working on the litigation and on the policy, I was also asked often to go out and speak to gay and lesbian LGBT groups, talk about the administration's policy positions. In the early part of the administration, people were very unhappy with in the LGBT community, were unhappy with the president, with the pace of change. They thought that we weren't moving fast enough, we weren't moving far enough. And it was, I would face some very hostile audiences when I would go out around the country and speak, especially when I went to university campuses. So by virtue of that work, I got onto the radar of the White House and the folks there who work on public engagement. And in 2013, after I'd already left the Department of Justice, was still working on LGBT issues, but at the Department of Homeland Security, along with a lot of other stuff, I got a call completely out of the blue saying, would you be interested in being the President's liaison to the American Jewish community? And I like to say, after going out and talking to the LGBT community, they thought, well, he did an okay job with them, let's see how he does with the Jews. The record, I guess, remains to be written on that. But, I had intersected with the Jewish community at various points in my past, but I hadn't been a, quote-unquote professional Jew. I hadn't worked at the Federation or at the ADL. I worked with them. I worked at a law firm with an Orthodox Jewish lawyer who did a lot of religious freedom and establishment clause litigation, an Orthodox American constitutional lawyer who was wonderful in the early part of my career. But I hadn't really been, deeply identified with the work or the leadership of the American Jewish community. And so it was, in a way, my work on LGBT rights that brought me back into the Jewish community, into the part of my identity that I hadn't really completely brought into my professional life. But, starting in July 2013, I did. And, in this role, and one of the reasons I decided to do it was because the American Jewish community, is small, but has a lot of depth and breadth across a whole range of issues, both domestic and international issues. So I knew that in this role, I would not be kind of pigeonholed into working on one discrete set of issues, but I would really have a chance to interact with my colleagues at the White House and throughout the agency on really many or most of the really important issues of the day that were being debated. So, for example, immigration reform, an issue which the American Jewish community has a very unique and compelling perspective because, of course, we all are ourselves immigrants and very much identify with that experience and the need to make sure that the ladder that we clients, when we came to this country, remains there for others who come behind us. Gun safety, the Affordable Care Act, which was a huge effort, to implement, to get passed and then implement the Affordable Care Act. Civil rights issues like LGBT equality or voting rights. These are issues that there are American Jewish organizations or parts of the American religious community, Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, or others who really play a very important role in working with the administration, with the White House on these priorities, and it was my role as a liaison to be the interface with the community and its leadership. Then we had issues that were, more specific to the Jewish community. For example, I had the opportunity to work on an issue that I had actually worked on when I was working in the U.S. Senate before the Obama administration, related to Holocaust issues. We had, became clear to us that there's a population of more than 150,000 Holocaust survivors in the United States. Obviously a shrinking population, but many of them are living at or below the poverty line. And this is a situation that just seems, to me and to all of us, untenable. That people who have suffered so much should have the right ability to live out their lives, with the dignity that they deserve. So, working especially with Vice President Biden, we undertook a whole initiative to assist domestic Holocaust survivors and provide them with support and assistance. We appointed the first ever special envoy for domestic Holocaust survivor services at Department of Health and Human Services. We got several million, $5 million of funding to go to HHS for grants to Holocaust survivors. We got a program set up through VISTA, which is run through the Corporation for National Community Service for volunteers to work specifically with Holocaust survivors to help them with, transportation and other needs. So this is something that, had a very strong connection to the Jewish community, and the community was very supportive and responsive, and was an important partner in our efforts. Now then, on the foreign policy side, which is frankly where I ended up spending most of my time, there was a lot of action. When I first got to the White House in July 2013, Secretary Kerry was just announcing that he was undertaking an effort to facilitate direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians over a 9-month period with the aim of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And clearly in connection with that, we undertook a tremendous amount of outreach and engagement with the Jewish community and its leadership, which were interested in this process. Some organizations were extremely supportive vocally of the process. Others were supportive but quieter, and some opposed it. But within the American Jewish community, there's a broad consensus in support of a two-state solution that was true then, remains true today. And in the middle of that effort, that was in November of 2013, was when it was announced that the United States and its allies and UN security, the partners on the UN Security Council, plus Germany, what's called P5+1, had reached a preliminary agreement with Iran to curtail its nuclear weapons program. And that interim agreement ultimately was in place for almost 2 years before a final agreement was reached last July. But that issue, from the very start, was one of intense focus and debate within the American Jewish community, within the larger foreign policy community, and something that I was very much involved in. It was actually one of the reasons that I stayed as long as I did in the White House, because I wanted to be there when and if and when there was a final agreement reached with between the P5+1 and Iran on its nuclear program to extend the breakout time and ensure that Iran would not be able to have a nuclear weapon. And last July, such an agreement was reached. It was announced on July 14th, and that launched a 60-day review period, which was the most intense period of my time at the White House, where the President and all of us working on this issue were, essentially 24/7 focused on this congressional review period in which Congress was reviewing deal, the opportunity to have an up or down vote. It's not a treaty, so the Senate didn't have to confirm it, but the administration had agreed to legislation that would afford Congress an opportunity to review it. And I was told by a senior official at the White House that my job was to talk to every Jew in America about the Iran nuclear deal. So I started talking to people and creating opportunities for others to talk to people. So one of the things that we did was a concerted outreach effort with the Jewish community. President Obama traveled to a synagogue in Washington, Adas Israel, which is the largest conservative synagogue, and was only the fourth president in U.S. history to speak at a synagogue in the United States. In that speech, he talked about his own connection to the Jewish community, his own strong ties. He called himself an honorary MOT, and he also talked about kind of the role that the American Jewish community plays when he said, earlier this year when we marked the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma, we remember the iconic images of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marching with Dr. King, praying with his feet. To some, it must have seemed strange that a rabbi from Warsaw would take such great risks to stand with a Baptist preacher from Atlanta. But Heschel explained that their cause was one and the same. In his essay, No Religion is an Island, he wrote, we must choose between interfaith and internihilism, between a shared hope that says together we can shape a brighter future, or a shared cynicism that says our world is simply beyond repair. Great line, and really a reflection of the president's own view and why he so closely identifies with our community, because of what he sees as a very strong force within our community to do exactly what he talked about, which is shaping a brighter future, putting our faith towards and our commitment to social justice towards broader ends. We had a webcast where the president addressed more than 10,000 people from the diplomatic room in the White House that was organized by Jewish federations in North America and the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. We had the president travel more recently, it was after the Iran deal, but another seminal engagement was in January of this year on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, when the president traveled to the Israeli embassy, the first president ever to speak at the embassy of Israel. And presidents don't usually speak at embassies anyway, but this was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it was a day on which several individuals who had American roots were going to be inducted to become righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, right? The Israeli Holocaust Memorial, which has been there, a long path, where all the individuals, non-Jews, who can be, where it was proven through some extensive evidentiary review that they had, taken extraordinary measures, put their own lives at risk to save Jews. And this was actually, to me, many of us, I think one of the most powerful interactions the president had with the Jewish community on these issues, because it was in this speech where, we had people that were being honored and some of the survivors who were saved. One of them who was being honored was this sergeant named Roddy Edmonds. He was a Christian from Tennessee, from Tennessee, and he was a sergeant during the war, World War II. He and his troops were arrested. They were put into a German POW camp. The commander of the camp said to him one day, "You need to identify for me all the Jews in your company." Presumably, once identified, he would be removed and killed. And Roddy Edmonds said that Geneva Conventions did not require him to do this. He would not do it. He would do the bare minimum that was required. And when pressed by the German commander, he said, "We are all Jews." Basically, if you're going to kill one, you have to kill all of us. And that line resonated very powerfully with the president, who talked about the fact and said, we are all Jews. He talked about it with respect to Roddy Edmonds, and he talked about it with respect to all of us today, and what that means, which ties back into what he said about Rabbi Heschel and Jewish experience in his speech at Adas, Israel. So that was an incredibly powerful experience, and so that was the beginning of my tenure at the White House. But on the back on the LGBT rights issue, I happened also to be at the White House when the marriage equality case was decided, the Obergefell case that established a fundamental right to marriage equality in all 50 states. And I like to tell this story because it was just an incredible day, and actually Craig was there, he remembers it well too. But that day, because I'm a lawyer, worked on, had been involved with this litigation, a member of the Supreme Court bar, I got a tip from somebody who was also involved in these cases that they thought that the case might be announced the next day. The Supreme Court doesn't tell you when it's handing down a particular case, so you have to sort of show up, and maybe it'll be handed down or maybe it won't. But we got a tip that it was going to be handed down, which was Friday, the end of June. So I got up at 4 in the morning to go to the Supreme Court and go into the courtroom and sit in the Supreme Court bar among all the lawyers who had worked on marriage equality cases, on other significant gay rights litigation over the years, dating back to the Lawrence and Bowers cases. It was a full courtroom, and there was tremendous anticipation. Justices come in, and you sort of see them come through this red curtain, and I immediately looked over to Justice Kennedy, because we all knew that if this case was coming down, he was going to be the one who wrote the decision. There was just no question about it. And I saw that he was holding like this, like a typewritten manuscript on top of, whatever briefs he had or whatever other papers, which suggested to me that he had something typed that he was going to read. Because what happens in the Supreme Court is when the decision is announced, the justice who writes the majority opinion gets asked to read that opinion. So go into the court, and the justices come in. Chief Justice Roberts sits down and says immediately, we have a decision in such and such case, Obergefell, blah blah blah, and everybody can't believe it. It's not only happening that day, but it's happening immediately. And right from there, Justice Kennedy begins to read this powerful, soaring opinion that affirms the fundamental dignity of gay and lesbian married, to have families, their equality under the Constitution. Everyone in the courtroom is in tears and can't believe this is actually happening. After he reads his decision, and Chief Justice Roberts, with a bit of a buzzkill, reads his dissent, but we won, right? So we're happy. So after the decisions are announced for that day, we go out to the plaza in front of the Supreme Court. It's a brilliant, summer day, and there are thousands of people on the plaza in front of the Supreme Court with huge rainbow flags, with banners, and they're celebrating, they're jubilant about this incredible historical moment. So I'm out there, talking to folks, hugging, tears, all of that, and I get an email on my BlackBerry that the president's about to go to the Rose Garden in 5 minutes. So I say, shoot, I got to get back to the White House. So I find a cab miraculously. I'm like, get to the White House. And, cab driver, I got to get there. The president's about to speak, I need to be there. So I get to the White House, run through the gates and into the West Wing and into the Rose Garden, where all of the White House staff is assembled, as the president is literally about to walk out and deliver a statement after the marriage equality decision has been handed down. And the staff are crying. I'm standing with Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, and with hugs and tears. And actually, we're in a photo on the colonnade, the path that the president walks every day when he walks the residence to the Oval. There's a bunch of staff that are gathered there, and we're watching him. And so Pete Souza, the president's photographer, took a photo of us, which then becomes like one of his photos of the year. The president's not in it, but you can see all of us staff watching him. The president comes out and talks about justice being delivered like a mighty thunderbolt, and this one, it doesn't happen every day, but when it happens, it's amazing, it's incredible, and this is a watershed moment, and it just is clearly one of the crowning achievements of this administration, this presidency, and this country in recent years to have moved the needle so far, so quickly on the issue of LGBT rights. later that day, the president went to South Carolina, sang Amazing Grace at a ceremony after the Charleston shooting, which was another amazing, terrible event that he had to do this, but it was amazing, amazing thing if you saw it. And then that night, that very night, I had previously been scheduled to speak at the LGBT synagogue in D.C. on the Pride Shabbat. It's called Beit Mishpacha. It's in downtown Washington. They hold services at the D.C. Jewish Community Center on 16th Street. So I went to deliver this, I don't know, Devar Torah, whatever it was, at their Pride Shabbat. And, on this unbelievable day, where sort of all these strains of my life kind of had come together. And, I had a talk written, which I basically just drew out, and I talked, from my heart about what had happened in this momentous day. And then I said to everybody in the congregation, now when you leave the congregation in the Oneg tonight, you need to walk over to 16th Street, turn left, and walk down to the White House. Because the White House is lit in rainbow colors, which is something that I only found out about that day. It was a closely held secret and an incredible symbol, right, of the culmination of this effort on marriage equality to have the White House bathed in rainbow colors. And thousands of people were gathered out there out in front of the White House taking photos and celebrating this momentous day. So that, have been part of, the administration, to be an openly gay appointee when that day happened, I think for all of us is something that we will treasure, forever as a cherished memory of our time in the administration. Just one day where I got to do some incredible things by virtue of the opportunities I had to serve. So my time at the White House concluded in March of 2016, this year, and it had to do with, I would have stayed to the end, but there are rules that pertain to the status under which I went as a detailee from another agency. But in any case, I had a chance to go to the State Department after my time at the White House had concluded. And at the State Department, I've continued to have the opportunity to do work that is at kind of intersection of my Jewish and gay identities. I'm working in connection with the American Jewish community because I work closely with the people in the department who handle foreign policy and relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and efforts to promote positive steps to the extent there are positive steps to be taken to have confidence building measures between Israelis and Palestinians going forward during what is obviously a difficult time. I'm part of the team that's still working on the communications and engagement around the Iran nuclear deal, which continues to be implemented and enforced and scrutinized. I work in the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, which is the office in which I'm a senior advisor. It's an office in the Office of the Secretary that is focused on that has a focus on LGBT rights, because LGBT rights are an important human rights issue around the world, where many countries you have laws criminalizing homosexuality, and persecution of LGBT individuals, and we're working with faith leaders here and around the world to try to do what we can through that lens to further the administration's commitment to advancing LGBT rights around the world, which is a commitment that the president has made. Symbolically now, many embassies fly rainbow flags during Pride Month. In fact, someone sent me a photo of a rainbow flag that was flown in Erbil in Iraq, of all places. So our reach on this issue is far and wide.
We want to ask you a question.
Yes. Oh, okay. So I'm wrapping up. So, and I've had a chance to work to go to Israel as part of an LGBT delegation in March with the ambassador during Pride Month this past June, and really just to wrap up, I would say my own experience in this administration, reflects the ways in which my own Jewish and gay identities intersect, and how they, can intersect in positive ways. For me, there's a lot in my experience and my story that can be attributed to being in the right place at the right time. But I guess throughout I've endeavored to remain committed to my interests, my values that are at my core, to being part of a small and particular community, the Jewish community, whose brightest lights individuals like Rabbi Heschel and Professor Heschel, recognize that we have a role to play, an indispensable role to play in perfecting our own nation and others. And it's really been, for me, an honor and a privilege to be able to do that as part of this administration. And I hope that all of you can find a way, after you leave Dartmouth or wherever you are, in your life, to find work that is also meaningful, personal, and hopefully broadly impactful. So thank you very much. I talked about it other stuff.
Sidra.
It's very inspiring what you have to say on many levels, but the thing that's uppermost in my mind was the thing that you kind of elided over a few times for, I think, obvious reasons, and that's the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is, I thought it was stalemate. I think it's hardly on anybody's radar now, frankly, for all the reasons that it is. And I don't know whether you want to elaborate on that as you look over, because clearly Obama was very much, as much as any other president in our lifetime, was very much committed to making that happen, and certainly Kerry. As I say, I think it's not only stalemated, but everybody seems to be backing away from it.
Right, there's not a whole lot I can really say. I mean, we have an office in the State Department, a special envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. That office exists. It was created, back before 2013. But it was, Martin Indyk held the post of special envoy. Now Frank Lowenstein holds that post. There's still, a tremendous amount of work that's being done. Secretary Kerry has met repeatedly recently with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with President Abbas. We continue to work to obviously reinforce the U.S.-Israel relationship, and there are efforts underway to negotiate memorandum of understanding on a defense agreement for military assistance, because of course security is a principal concern on the part of the Israelis. But as the president has said, he's focused both on an agreement that ensures security of Israel, but also recognizes the dignity of the Palestinians by giving them a state of their own. And I think we are focused on measures, as I said in my talk, confidence-building measures that can hopefully move the parties in a positive direction. But it's
Could I follow up on that question and
decision.
just sharpen it slightly and say that I guess what surprises me from the work that you did as a White House liaison, what surprises me is that there was an awful lot, a large segment of the American Jewish community that was not happy with President Obama's stances, various stances regarding Israel and the Iran deal and other things. And yet it seems the picture you've portrayed is very positive. And I guess I wonder even why President Obama would be even willing to go to the Israeli embassy to make these constant gestures, as if is he unaware of the opposition? No, he must be aware that so many American Jews opposed him. So how does he evaluate that opposition?
Right. Well, he doesn't. First of all, he doesn't personalize things. And so to the extent people focus on personal relationships between him or any particular other leaders, that's not what informs his view of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel, or I think really frankly any other country. He is strongly and deeply, to his core, supporter of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, unshakable relationship. He uses language and describes himself in a way that he was a Zionist. He understands the history of Israel. It's why the necessity of the existence of the state of Israel for historical reasons, both recent and more ancient. So, I think that,
Political relationships.
but so I don't think he's going to let if there's opposition in the American Jewish community to him, he's not going to back off of his support for Israel because some people in the American Jewish community may, disagree with him and believe that he has been less supportive in their view than he should be, because he knows that he has been supportive, and he also knows that there's a significant portion, in fact, the majority of the American Jewish community that is supportive of him and his policies towards Israel and our relationship.
But just following up on these last two questions, the MOUs seem to have gone a lot less smooth than they were with previous administrations. And just recently there was a report by the State Department on settlements, which aroused a lot of antipathy within some segments of the Jewish community. So I wonder if there are currents that, from what you
What
said,
report on settlement? You're talking about the Quartet
the State
report?
Department put
You're talking
out
about the Quartet
a
report?
critical of Israel on settlements just last week, and there was a lot of blowback about the fact that Netanyahu's settlement policy has actually less settlements than previous Israeli administrations. So, and so there was criticism: why are you attacking us on the settlements? And again, as if the settlements were the major obstacle to moving forward on Israeli-Palestine negotiations. But it looks like from the outside that the administration is not as favorable or working as closely and amiably as they did in the past. I wonder if you have...
No, I mean, that's certainly not the case. I mean, we're certainly working incredibly closely. We have a strategic dialogue, the MOU negotiations continue. I'm not going to comment on them, but the president has said repeatedly that he is committed to and supportive and wants to see a MOU achieved, and the Israelis have said exactly the same thing. So, notwithstanding disagreements that we've had with, Israel over, the Iran deal or whatever, we continue to work extremely closely in strategic coordination and cooperation between our two countries, between our intelligence services, has been and continues to be incredibly strong. And in addition, the amount of military assistance, you look at it in dollars, is far and away the greatest in this administration than in any other administration. So, it seems that, for whatever reason, some people overlook these facts and have another narrative that actually doesn't comport with the reality. On the settlements issue, we have a well-stated, a long-standing position that other presidents in both parties have maintained. The settlements are illegitimate, but in another recent public report, the Quartet report, which talked about settlements, it also was very critical of incitement on the part of the Palestinians. So, it is, it's not, certainly not the president's, or this administration's goal to put the thumb on the scale in any way that is disadvantaging the, Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship, or the strength of that relationship, while at the same time we are, trying to encourage to take steps that will move this process forward, but recognizing that, the United States can't enforce on Israeli Palestinians a solution to the conflict that has to result from negotiation. Yeah.
What's an MOT?
Member of the tribe. MOU, memorandum of understanding. MOT, member of the tribe. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned about the Iran deal,
Yeah.
and you said it had put off Iran getting nuclear weapons. Now, what I understood, and I may not have understood correctly, but what I understood was that it put it off for 10 years, after which there's no restriction on Iran, whatever it likes to do, it can go ahead and do.
Well, that's not correct. I mean, what it does is actually for, there are various timelines in the Iran deal, and we charted these out, on timelines when the deal was announced. There's a certain limitation on, the amount of enrichment, the level of enrichment that expires within 15 years. But at the same time, in agreeing to this, Iran has agreed in perpetuity to never develop a nuclear weapon. It's a commitment that is made in the Iran deal perpetuity. There are other provisions in the deal that survive, that extend beyond the 10 or 15-year timeline. So while there will be some limitations removed or some oversight that changes, in this interim period, we have unparalleled access to their program. We have 24-hour inspections of their declared nuclear facilities. We have the ability to inspect other facilities if we suspect that there may be activity going on. And certainly in that window, we're going to have the ability to amass a tremendous amount of information, understanding of this program that will be helpful 15 years down the road when some of the limitations are removed. But the United States negotiated the best deal that it felt it could get that would, credibly achieve the objective, which is to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And there's no question that this agreement does and has in this period, and that's been demonstrated time and again. And it's being implemented, and it is working. And, on the other hand, Iran got sanctions relief that it was promised, on that end, and so it is working. And nobody is saying that it's not working or that Iran is doing anything today. In theory, could there be things that could be done down the road? Yeah, but we have now a strong agreement that was one that would achieve our objective in the immediate and near term.
Do you think you could have added to it that Iran should not use the money to support terrorism throughout the world?
Well, there was there was a decision made when these negotiations were undertaken that these negotiations would focus exclusively on the nuclear issue, that we were going to take the wolf out of the Middle East, of a nuclear-armed Iran. That was going to be the biggest threat to security of Israel, security of other allies in the region. And once you start linking it up with all these other issues, then it would never have been able to be achieved. So this was to achieve a significant, one of really what is the most important foreign policy accomplishments of this administration, and at the same time to be very aware of Iran's ongoing activities in other areas, to continue to sanction those activities, to call them out as we have been doing.
Did you have counterparts in the White House of the liaison, let's say, to the Catholic community or to other Jewish?
There's faith liaison. There's only Jewish liaison position is somewhat unique, and I think it goes back to earlier administrations. My understanding is that it was during the Eisenhower administration that John Foster Dulles wanted the Conference of Presidents created and one entity to deal with the Jewish community. And I don't know the exact history, but actually during the Republican administrations, the Jewish liaison was a multimillionaire from Detroit named Max Fisher, who was the most prominent probably the most prominent Jewish Republican. He had this job then. So different people have held it at different levels of seniority over many. Noam Neusner held it. Right, a lot of different folks have held it. So it's a unique role, and also it has a unique responsibility of planning the White House Hanukkah party, which is two 600 people parties back to back when the White House is kosher, and it's an incredible event. But it's a big,
Did you plan the Seder as well?
Seder I have a role in, but that was a private Obama family event that they did with certain campaign staff that they've been with every
Did they
single
have
year.
an orange on the Seder plate?
I think I pushed for that the year I did. Yes, and props to you for your yes.
Anybody else? No? Then, well, please
Thank
join me in thanking you.